guys, today we're going to talk about woven fabrics and the weaves that make them up, the different types and characteristics of each one of those weaves. So the first thing that's very important to know is what is the difference between a woven fabric and a knit fabric. Now all textiles, except for some exceptions like leather, but all textiles that use yarn are going to fall into one of two categories, either woven or knit. And of course today we're going to be talking about woven fabrics and the weaves that make them up. But it's crucial, really crucial, for any fashion or interior designer to know the difference between knits and wovens. In fact, if there's one piece of information I'd love for you to take out of this class, is how to easily be able to tell the difference between a knit and a woven. Now, why is it so important that we know the difference? Well, it's important that we know all the different characteristics of our fabric because they can all either enhance or detract to the characteristics of whatever we're trying to design with them. Particularly so for woven versus knit, because the composition of both of these different types of fabric are radically different. Their different structure and composition gives them radically different characteristics. So much so that the construction of garments made with knits and wovens must be much different. So if I was to make the same garment, say a shirt or something like that, with a woven fabric, it would by necessity need to be constructed very differently than with a knit fabric. Now there's many other different factors to this with drape and fit and performance. But we'll stay with that. So very important to know the difference between knit and woven fabrics because some garments are going to be suitable for woven where they're not suitable for knit and vice versa. And same thing for upholstery fabrics or any other different type of item or garment that you're going to make with a fabric. It's either suitable for a woven or a knit. And if it's suitable for both, it still needs to be actually constructed and made in a very different way depending on what fabric you're using. So take a look at the woven and the knit. Now there are many different types of woven fabrics and knit fabrics that are going to look very different from this. But these are some very basic images of how a very basic weave will look and a very basic knit will look. So in general, they'll look like one of these two. They'll either have this sort of interlocking crisscross pattern with these sort of yarns and lines going at 90-degree intersections with each other, or they'll have a face that looks like these tiny little V's that are coming into each other. These tiny little V's are actually loops, and we'll talk about a little bit about that more. So look at the difference of the texture. It's very, very obvious to know. Now you might have to look real close because these are very zoomed in, and sometimes we're working with wovens or knits that with very, very tiny fine yarns that you might have to look very, very closely, even sometimes under your pick glass to be able to tell the difference. But even on a small scale, they'll typically usually have either one of these face textures. And that'll be your first indication or your first clue on whether it's a knit or woven. And it's a very good one as well to look at the actual texture of the fabric. It's actually going to be the best. There's a couple other little bit of tips and tricks, but sometimes they're not foolproof. So, the difference between woven and knit fabrics is in how they're made. So how are woven fabrics made? So woven fabrics are made using two sets of many yarns. Sometimes they're more than two sets, but our basic piece of woven fabric needs two sets. And we can see the sets, one running lengthwise and one running crosswise. They are called the warp, running in the lengthwise direction, and the weft, running in the crosswise direction. These yarns are interlocked together. And most woven fabrics, again, will have that crisscross pattern on the top. Woven fabrics do not stretch unless spandex is added to the fiber mix. Spandex will make the yarns themselves stretchy and will allow woven fabrics to be stretchy. So it used to be a lot easier to tell the difference between a woven and a knit because any fabric that did not stretch was automatically a woven, which is still true. So if a fabric does not stretch, it's probably a woven. If it does stretch, it could still be a woven. And that is because of spandex. We have the ability now to make the yarns themselves stretchy. So if it does not stretch, it's a woven. If it does stretch, it's either a woven with spandex or it's a knit. Okay, so it's a little bit more complicated, but just know if it does not stretch, it's probably woven. If it does stretch, you're not quite at the end yet. You still have to sort of look very closely, look at the texture, see if it looks more like a woven fabric, if it has that crisscross pattern, or if it has that looping sort of V, that little V pattern, the V's in set with each other. So here's the sort of basic understanding of how to make a weave. And again, this is very, very basic, very, very simple. The sort of bare minimum that you need for a woven fabric. As we'll learn, there's many, many ways to vary this and make it a little bit more complex and get something different. But we have our warp set of yarns. Again, a set is raised up, a set is raised down. We insert a weft or filler yarn through it. Then when we come over here, we will pack down that weft yarn, go back, flip our yarns, and continue going on. And this is creating what we call a plain weave, which we'll learn a little bit more about later in the lesson. So how are knit fabrics created? Knit fabrics are created by looping loops on loops. So the first thing we do is we make a row of loops. Boop, 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 boop. Then what we do is we take another row of loops and loop them through the first, and so on and so forth. And that way we create our knit fabric. Now this can be done with only with one continuous yarn, so that's another difference where we have to have cut sets of different yarns for our woven fabric. We can make a piece of fabric out of just one yarn. It can be done with more yarns if different colors are desired, or different sort of specialty textures. All knits have stretch to them. Now this is not because spandex has been added to them, it has to do with the actual structure of the knit. Because we use loops instead of packed down interlocking yarns, we have a little bit of give. Every time we loop a loop, there's still a little bit of space. There's a little wiggle room or a little give room. So when we're stretching our knit fabric, we're just pulling each and every little loop a little bit tighter through. And since we have a little bit of give and a little bit of space with the knit loops, all those little gives on all those little loops make it stretchy. Now this, again, is not because we have spandex in them, and it's not because the yarn itself is stretchy. It's because of the composition of the knit, because we have a little extra space and a little extra give between those loops. Now, that doesn't mean that spandex can't be used in knit fabrics, and many times it is. And in that case, the stretch is just stretchier. If we want to enhance the stretch for something super, super stretchy, super has a lot of give, a lot of flexibility, we'll add spandex to the yarns that we use to knit. We get, again, just a super stretchy fabric. So now we know a little general idea of how the woven fabrics come together, how they're different from knits. Let's take a closer look at the different aspects of our woven fabric. So the first are our warp yarns. So warp yarns are the first to be set up in the weaving process. And you can see them here. They're the long, lengthwise yarns set up on these two looms. Now these two, this is just a home craft loom, and this is like an antique, maybe, you know, very hundreds of years old style loom, still probably like used just for crafts at home, even though it's more complex than this one. I want to show you an industrial loom, but most of the mechanisms for the industrial loom are encased in machinery, but the principle is the same. Okay? So warp yarns are set up first and placed under tension. So as you can see here, they're being pulled from one bar to another, and they're here under all this tension. Now this means that warp yarns have to be pretty strong to withstand the tension that they are put under during the weaving process. So you can't use kind of weak or decorative yarns in the warp yarn section. Got to use strong ones. Now once those warp yarns have been set up, here they are, these ones are the warp yarns, the weft yarns can be inserted in and interlaced between the warp yarns. They come in at a 90-degree angle and lace in an over-under pattern. Depending on the weave, that over-under pattern is going to change, as we'll learn. But they go kind of over-under, 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 and then get pushed down into the actual fabric. They're put in at a 90-degree angle, and because they're not put under tension, and they're automatically, as soon as they're put in, they're sort of strengthened by the overall structure of the fabric. So in the weft, we can use those weaker, more decorative yarns. Weft yarns are inserted through the warp yarns using a tool called a shuttle, a shuttlecock, or boat. And there's a picture of one right here. I definitely call that one a boat because it looks like a boat. Now these are both hand looms, and the shuttles don't always look like this. In fact, down here we can see the shuttle, very different type of shuttle down here. But they're always used, and of course these two are also hand looms. In industrial machines, the shuttle or the boat is not run through by hand, of course, it's run through by mechanism, but the mechanism itself is still called the same thing. So all together now. So when we put all those parts together, our length and our crosswise grain together, a few other parts of the woven fabric emerge. But first, let's sort of take a look at our piece of fabric over here. It has all of our main parts of a woven fabric. We, of course, have the lengthwise grain, which is created by our warp yarns. So we can also call it the warp-wise grain or the true grain. All these things are the same. So there's a lot of different names for a lot of these different things. So if I'm talking about the length grain, the true grain, the warp-wise grain, it's all the same thing. Same down here with our crosswise grain, which is, again, created by our weft yarns. So it's also called the weftwise grain. And similarly before, if I call in our crosswise yarns, our weft yarns, our filler yarns, they all are the same thing. They're just different terms for the same thing. So if you say the weftwise grain or you say the crosswise grain, it doesn't really matter. You're talking about the same thing. So we know what those are, but once we put those together, what we also have is a third grain that arises, which is the bias grain. Now the bias grain is not defined by a set of yarns like the lengthwise and crosswise grain is. There's no set of yarns that are running at this diagonal through the fabric. What it is defined by is the 45-degree intersection between the length and cross grains. So if we take a look up here, if I imagine my cross grain coming over here, and the length grain coming up here, if I go at a even diagonal or a 45-degree angle to those two, we get the bias grain. Now why is the bias grain important? The bias grain has some interesting characteristics of its own, and designers often choose to drape on the bias when they have something that needs to be draped or be flowing rather nicely. Now, when fabrics or woven fabrics are draped on the bias, they'll create nice rounded curves, nice rounded flares. So if I want to make something like a cowl or something with a lot of nice full rounded drapes or flares, I might consider draping on the bias to get that effect out of my fabric. In addition, the bias does not fray. So when fabric is cut on the bias, so if I cut down this bias line right here, these edges are going to be very resistant to fraying. And that's actually how pinking shears work, because they cut in those little zigzags, which are all 45-degree angles to the length and cross grain usually. So they're just cutting little bias edges everywhere, which prevent fraying of the fabric. In addition, we have the selvage. Now the selvage is created when we put our weft yarns in through our warp yarns. What happens is we'll put in a weft yarn, it'll go across like this, and then when we reach the end it wraps around and goes the other direction, and then we get here and it wraps around and goes the other direction, wraps around, goes across, wraps around, goes across, so on and so forth. And what happens is all those wrapping arounds creates a lovely little bound edge along the side of the fabric. And we'll always have two selvage edges for a woven fabric. So here's one of them, and here is the other one. Now sometimes it is very, very easy to tell where the selvage is because the selvage will be large, it'll be a different color, there may even be mill or print information put into the selvage. There could be holes where the fabric was used to sort of spool through the loom. And a lot of times the selvage is going to be very easy to tell where it is. But sometimes that's not always the case. Sometimes it's small and it's not a different color. And those mill holes where it's the little tiny holes on the selvage where the fabric is being spooled through the loom are very, very subtle and very hard to see. And sometimes they've been sort of worn away if it's an old fabric. You can't even see them at all anymore. So how do you always know where the selvage is? Well, there's one fact that we can always use, and that's the fact that it is a bound edge. So if I have a piece of selvage and I try to pick out different pieces of yarns or pick out a piece of yarn from the selvage, I can't do it because it's bound. It's not going to fray. I can't unravel it. So if you have an edge like that, that's your selvage edge. If you can't unravel it. Now our other edges over here, you can see they're already starting to fray. That's sort of what this is. These little, looks like tassels, but that's the fraying edge of the fabric. So when we cut through here, if we cut anywhere that's not the selvage, except for of course the bias base, if you put your mind to it, you can start to fray those edges. They're not quite as solid as the selvage. The selvage will not unravel. The bias is simply fray resistant. But the cross grain over here or other cuts of the fabric, it will be very easy to start to pick out different yarns, and you'll be able to, just with your fingernails, start to fray the fabric. So you'll know those edges are not your selvage edge. So why is it important to know where the selvage is? Well, if you're going to sew anything, that's probably the first thing you're going to identify in the fabric you're going to use, because it lets us know where the length grain is, how the length grain is running along that fabric. And that's because the selvage always runs in the same direction as our length grain. So if we have the selvage on this edge of the fabric, I know that the length grain is going to run parallel or in the same direction as that selvage. And then our cross grain is going to run at a 90-degree angle to that selvage edge. Very important when we sew things, because when we sew things, we typically have to align all the pattern pieces with the length grain. If we don't know where that length grain is, we can't do that. And if we don't do that, our clothing will hang, let's say, wonky. It'll maybe fall to one side, it'll bunch kind of weirdly, and so forth. So, how do we use a pick glass? A pick glass is going to start to become relevant in this course when we use it to get a better look at our weaves. You should have gotten a pick glass with your textile kit. If not, you can buy one for pretty cheaply on Amazon or anywhere else. They're not expensive. And I recommend you getting it. It'll let you see fabric in a new way and let you detail them and understand what they look like a little bit better. It'll also help you identify the different types of fabric and understand their characteristics a little bit better. So pick glasses are often used in the textile industry to better view the yarns and weave of a piece of fabric. They consist of a magnifying glass up here mounted on an empty base that usually has, a little bit of measurement here. And this one looks like it has metric on one side and imperial on the other. So they're typically, for us, if you're going to buy it in America, they're usually done in a 1 inch by 1 inch square. So not only can you use this pick glass to better see a fabric weave and the yarns that make it up, but you can also tell how many yarns or threads per inch a fabric has. So let's talk about that a little bit. So thread count. Now if you've ever bought bed sheets, you've heard the phrase thread count. Now thread count is used throughout the textile industry, but most people, most lay people are used to the phrase thread count when they buy bed sheets, because bed sheets will advertise what kind of thread count they have. A higher thread count is more desirable. So if you have bought, you see here it's a 200 threads per inch or 300 threads per inch. However, most experts agree that you can't tell by feel any discernible difference once you get above 400 threads per inch. So when you're talking about threads per inch, a lot of, the bedding industry has gone a little bit crazy. And you'll see 1,000 threads per inch, these crazy numbers. But that's all sort of a little bit of a marketing gimmick. It may actually have, that many threads per inch, but between 1,000 threads per inch and 400, you won't be able to tell the difference. And honestly, what's more important than thread count is the quality of the fiber and yarns being used. So if it's crappy cotton that's being used, I don't care if it's 5,000 thread count, it's still not going to feel as nice as even a 200 or 300 count that uses really high quality cotton. Anywho, that's my bedding rant. How do we actually find the thread count and what does it mean? Well, thread count is usually done, especially in America, based on an inch by inch square sampling of the fabric. So typically when we hear about thread count, it's so many threads per inch, and that's per inch square. So when we put our pick glass onto a piece of fabric like this, the base is going to square off an inch by inch square. And that's represented by this little box right here. What we do is we look through the magnifying glass and we count how many warp yarns are in the 1 by 1 inch square. Let's do it. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9. So there are 9 what we call ends per inch, or EPI. And that is, again, how many warp yarns are in a 1 by 1 inch square of the fabric. We will also go ahead and count the number of weft yarns in the square. Let's do it. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8. So we have 8 picks per inch, or PPI. And this, of course, is the number of weft yarns in that square. So we got 9 warp yarns, or ends per inch, and 8 weft or picks per inch. What we're going to do is we're going to add up those two numbers, and you can see this is the number of threads per inch a fabric has. So what we have when we add 8 and 9 together is 17. So this particular sample fabric has 17 threads per inch. Now that is extremely low. Most fabrics, especially most industrial fabrics, are going to have way more than that. And a lot of times you'll get tired of counting, so you'll just average the number of, so if you only count for a 1/4 inch, you'll count how many are in that 1/4 inch and then times it by 4. If you don't want to count all the way to 100 or 300 or something like that. Understanding fabric descriptions. So this is a very common way to describe fabric in the industry. And this would tell me everything I really needed to know about a particular piece of fabric. Maybe, well, in composition wise, because we'll get into finishes and everything later. But this is a good start. So detailed descriptions of fabric are necessary in the textile, fashion, and interior design industries. And this is probably something a little bit more than you're going to see in your typical, retail hobby fabric store like Mood. If you go in, you're not going to see this level of description. And most of the people that work at Mood, unfortunately, won't even know what this means anyway. So be careful. It's interesting. The more you get to learn about fabric, the more you realize that all those people you thought knew about fabric don't really know anything. And you'll start seeing things mislabeled in fabric stores or on websites, or buying a few yards of fabric on the internet, and it gets home and this isn't what they said it was. Anywho, so let's break this down. Let's break this description down. So if I have a piece of fabric and it's labeled as a 2-ply 76 by 68 100% plain weave cotton, what does that mean? Well, a couple of these things we should know already. Let's start over here with 2-ply. Well, we've had our yarn course, so we know what 2-ply should mean. 2-ply lets us know that plied yarn was used in the weaving of this fabric. In this case, 2 finer yarns were spun together to create 1 single yarn. So remember, the number of plies represents how many yarns were twisted together to create a single yarn. And this is actually how they get those crazy yarn count numbers, because they count, even though they're kind of not supposed to, that, how do you get to 1,000 yards per thread? It's because they use these very, very fine plies, and they count the number of each ply that goes toward the thread count. So it's a little deceptive. It's a bit of a marketing gimmick, so on and so forth. So, okay, we know what that means. We know what plied yarn means. This fabric was made using a 2-ply yarn. Okay, got it. Next, we have 76 by 68. What does this mean? Oh. Well, we just learned how to do the thread count. This is basically the thread count. 76 by 68 tells us the ends per inch, or the warp ends, or EPI, in an inch by inch square. So there are 76 warp yarns in 1 square inch of this fabric. Likewise, there are 68 weft yarns per square inch of fabric, or 68 picks per inch. The warp ends, in this sort of construction, the warp ends are always shown first, followed by the weft picks. Okay, cool. So now we know that this is a 2-ply fabric, that it has 76 warp yarns per square inch and 68 weft yarns per inch, and if we add those together, we get 144. So we know this it has a thread count of 144 threads per inch. Okay, we're getting there. The next one's easy. I think even without taking this class, you could get the next one. 100% cotton means that the yarns were made, the fiber used to make the yarns for this fabric were 100% cotton. Okay? Easy peasy. The last lets us know the weave type of the fabric. And plain weave is a type of weave type. And we'll get to that in the next section. So now you know a little bit more about how the descriptions we can use for woven fabrics. So don't let these numbers confuse you if you do see them in the industry, because you should know right away what they mean. And we're going to pick up and learn a little bit more about those weave types in our next section. See you then.